Virtually all the world's myths and scriptures can be shown to be built on a foundation of celestial metaphor. Recently, I was asked about the prophecies in the scriptures relating to the Abomination of Desolation, which is mentioned in the books of Daniel, Mark, and Matthew in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. These passages are part of prophecies, which continue to garner a lot of attention and scrutiny, especially from those who want to interpret ancient scripture in what I call a literalistic fashion. Although the style of these passages is prophetic, they are actually allegorical in nature. They are not talking about future historical events any more than the stories about Samson or Solomon or Doubting Thomas are talking about historical past events. The characters and episodes in the scriptures of the Bible, as Alvin Boyd Kuhn explained more than 80 years ago, are picturizations of that which is our living experience at all times. He said, "The one actor in every portrayal, in every scene, is the human soul. The Bible is the drama of our history here and now, and it is not apprehended in its full force and applicability until every reader discerns himself or herself to be the central figure in it. Instead of relating to the incidents of a remote epoch in temporal history, it deals with the reality of the living present in the life of every soul on earth." We're going to see clear evidence that the prophetic passages in Daniel, Mark, and Matthew are allegorical and esoteric in nature, and that they are not describing some other epoch in earthly history, whether past or future. They are, in fact, based on celestial metaphor in this case of a very special type, which is found in some other ancient myths from around the world, by no means all. A special subcategory which I call dual horizon myths, or dual horizon metaphors, in which the action in the story links the rising of one constellation with the setting of another constellation, tying them together in some way that involves the opposite actions of rising and setting. To illustrate this concept, let's have a look at the mythology surrounding the goddess Durga from the myths and sacred traditions of ancient India, sacred traditions which continue to this day. The goddess Durga is still one of the most important deities in the Hindu tradition, and Durga Puja is celebrated for 10 days each year. It's a very big celebration and ritual. As I've written on numerous occasions in both books and blog posts, the goddess Durga can be clearly identified with the constellation Virgo. First, she's closely associated with a lion and sometimes even depicted riding on a lion, just as the zodiac constellation of Virgo is located immediately adjacent to the zodiac constellation of Leo in the night sky. She's a warrior goddess. She's often depicted bearing a weapon in an outstretched arm, which corresponds to the distinctive outstretched arm of the outline of the constellation Virgo. She's also associated with a serpent, usually depicted as a cobra snake, and the constellation Virgo is adjacent to the longest serpent constellation in the night sky, the water serpent known as Hydra, which, in fact, has a ring-shaped circle of stars at its head, which could be envisioned as the hood of a cobra. In some ancient descriptions of the goddess, she's also described as bearing a banner of peacock plumes, which I'm convinced is a reference to the beautiful outline of the constellation Coma Berenices, located in the heavens just above Virgo's outstretched arm. But the clue which should conclusively demonstrate that the goddess Durga is associated with the constellation Virgo is the fact that, according to ancient tradition, Durga slays an asur named Mahishasur, who is depicted as having the head of a bull and the body of a powerful male human figure, usually bearing a club. And if you're familiar with the constellations in the night sky, you'll realize that there is indeed a bull in the heavens, the constellation Taurus, and that it is located just above the outline of the constellation Orion, which has the appearance of a powerful figure brandishing a club. In the ancient myths, Durga slays Mahishasur by severing the bull's head from his body, and indeed, in the heavens, the outline of Orion can be envisioned as lacking a clearly visible head. But the head of Taurus, with its long horns, can be seen to be located just a little ways away from the body of Orion, as if it had been severed from the body, if Orion and Taurus are imagined as going together, as they clearly are in the figure of Mahishasur. What makes this interpretation all the more compelling is the fact that Orion and Taurus are positioned in the heavens such that they can be seen to be sinking down into the western horizon when Virgo is rising up above the eastern horizon. Virgo is rising, and Orion and Taurus are setting, which is why the myth of Durga envisions the goddess associated with Virgo as being the slayer of Mahishasur, associated with Orion and Taurus. When one constellation is rising and the other is setting, it's sometimes the case that the ancient myths from around the world will allegorize the one that is rising as slaying the one that is setting. I call this dual horizon action. A similar dual horizon myth can be seen in the celestial foundations of the myth of Perseus and the Gorgons, or Gorgons, in the mythology of ancient Greece. In that story, the hero Perseus slays the dreaded monster Medusa. I believe that this myth is based on the constellation Perseus, not least of the reasons being that the constellation actually bears his name, but also because the outline of Perseus features, for instance, a pointed hat, and in the Greek myth, Perseus is lent a cap of invisibility by the god Hermes, and that cap is usually depicted in ancient artwork as a style of cap known as a Phrygian cap, which is pointed in shape and usually has ear flaps. And you can very much see that outline in the stars which form the head of the constellation Perseus itself. Additionally, in the ancient Greek accounts, Perseus uses a special curved blade known as a harpy blade or harpe sword, which can be seen in some very ancient artwork. And then note in the constellation of Perseus in the sky that there is this distinctive curved hand. It curves back towards his head. That curve is on the hand on the east side of the constellation. And it's in the constellation's outline, and it corresponds to the harpy sword and is almost certainly the inspiration for that aspect of the story. So we can tie Perseus in the story to Perseus in the sky. And I've also included several pages of discussion of the identity of Medusa in my 2016 book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2. And there I provide abundant evidence which points to the conclusion that Medusa corresponds to the constellation Hercules in the night sky. I don't mean that Medusa and the mythical figure of Hercules are one and the same. I mean that the constellation Hercules plays many different figures in many different myths, sometimes playing the role of Hercules or Heracles, but appears as many different figures in many different myths, sometimes even as female figures such as Medusa. You can see the distinctive outline in which Medusa and the other Gorgons are very often depicted in ancient Greek and Etruscan artwork, corresponding very closely to the stars which form the outline of the constellation Hercules in the heavens. Also, that fringe of snakes around the head of the monster gives the head a rather square appearance in the artwork depicting Medusa or the other Gorgons, just as the head of Hercules, the constellation, is formed by a recognizable square of stars in the night sky. And once again, when Perseus is rising in the east, the constellation Hercules can be seen to be setting into the west, giving rise to the dual horizon action in the myth of Perseus and the Gorgons. Perseus slays Medusa because Medusa, played by the constellation Hercules, is seen sinking down, disappearing behind the western horizon when Perseus is rising up from the horizon in the east. But the ancient myths use other metaphors to allegorize a dual horizon action. Some ancient myths, it's not always the case that the constellation which is rising is described as slaying the constellation that's setting. For example, in another ancient Greek myth, the account of the sacrifice of the princess Iphigenia, in some versions of the story, from very ancient sources, including Stasinus, but even some accounts attributed to Hesiod, the girl Iphigenia is not actually slain, but rather she's carried away by the goddess Artemis, who replaces the girl on the sacrificial altar with a stag. So she brings a stag and she spirits away Iphigenia, and then she carries Iphigenia away to the land of a people identified as the Taurians, who bow down to her. They bow down to her because Artemis made her a goddess, or Artemis made her the priestess of Artemis in that land, or both, immortal. She makes her immortal and the priestess of Artemis. And so the Taurians bow down to her. I'm convinced that in the accounts of this sacrifice of Iphigenia, the girl is associated with Virgo the Virgin. That substitutionary stag corresponds to the nearby constellation of Centaurus, the centaur, which can also be envisioned as a stag with a branching rack of antlers. Instead of as a centaur with human hands, those hands can become the antlers if you envision it as a stag. It's right next to Virgo, so therefore the substitutionary stag. And the reason that the ancient accounts tell us that Artemis carried Iphigenia away to the Taurians, who bowed down to her in worship, is that same dual horizon action that we saw in the stories of the goddess Durga from ancient India. The constellation Taurus is sinking down, or in this case, bowing down. It's sinking down to the western horizon just as Virgo is rising in the east. So therefore the story has the people of the Taurians, the stars of Taurus, are bowing down to her. There's also evidence of dual horizon metaphors in the scriptures of the Bible themselves. In fact, in a very foundational text in the biblical scriptures found in Genesis, the account of Adam and Eve and the serpent, particularly in Genesis chapter 3, I've presented a lot of evidence and arguments in books and videos and blog posts to support the conclusion that Adam and Eve and the serpent correspond to the constellations Boötes, Virgo, and Hydra in the night sky. For instance, when the Lord God casts them out of the garden in Genesis 3, they are cast out in this order. He addresses them in this order. First the serpent, then the woman, then the man. And that's the same order that the constellations will sink down and disappear behind the western horizon. They'll sink down into the west. First the serpent, then the woman, then the man. And also the serpent is told he'll go upon his belly and he'll eat dust, which is exactly what you see with Hydra as he sinks down to the western horizon. The man is told that he will return to dust because he came from dust. For dust thou art, unto dust shalt thou return, Genesis 3:19. So if you understand the celestial metaphor underlying the world's ancient myths and scriptures, if you understand that these are celestial metaphors, they're talking about heavenly things that are happening in the sky, then you can see that that declaration is true for a constellation which rises up out of the eastern horizon, coming from the dust, and then sets in the western horizon, returning to the dust. That garden from which the characters are banished is the heavens, the heavenly garden of the sky itself. And the dual horizon action in this episode is when we're told in Genesis 3:24 that when the Lord God drove them out, he placed at the east of Eden cherubim, that is a powerful order of the angels, and a flaming sword, which turned every way. As the Reverend Robert Taylor explained in lectures from the 1830s, this is where I got this interpretation in this particular case, the verse, he argued and gives evidence that this verse is referring to the constellation Perseus, which can be seen to be rising up in the east as the constellations representing Adam and Eve are sinking down out of the garden in the west. Note that Perseus does indeed hold a sword which turns in all directions, as we've already discussed in the Greek myth of Medusa and the Gorgons. Also, although Robert Taylor doesn't say this, if someone were to object, well, wait a minute, the text seems to indicate plural cherubim. The King James actually says cherubims and a flaming sword. Well, the answer to that is, first of all, single constellations in the myths can sometimes play the role of multiple figures, just like in the Gorgon myth. Hercules plays Medusa and her sisters, I believe. But also, in this case, there's a strong possibility that the constellation Andromeda plays an angel as well. She's immediately adjacent to Perseus, and I've presented some detailed discussion of the story of Balaam and his talking donkey from the book of Judges, in which I argue and find plenty of evidence that that angel which blocks the path of Balaam corresponds to Andromeda. So Andromeda definitely plays angels in some myths. So those cherubims at the east of Eden may be describing both Perseus and Andromeda, but Perseus is the one bearing the sword which turns in all directions, the flaming sword. So now, with our understanding of this important concept of a dual horizon metaphor in the ancient myths, let's turn to the passages in question regarding this prophecy of the Abomination of Desolation. It's found in Daniel chapters 11 and 12, which are the last two chapters of the book of Daniel, and then again in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark chapter 13. Those are parallel passages. There's also some references in Luke which seem to be maybe referring to the same concept, particularly in Luke 21. But for the scope of this discussion, we'll primarily look at Mark 13 as a primary source of material for analysis, but with references to the others as necessary for additional evidence and clarification when we need to find things from other verses. So first, let me just say that passages in the Bible which are using this kind of prophetic type language or cast in terms of prophetic visions can sometimes be more difficult and uncertain to unpack than narrative passages which are trying to tell some kind of coherent story. In episodes where there's a story, such as the story of Samson going through his various adventures, or even that story of Adam and Eve, the text is trying to make a coherent narrative, so they sometimes put in more contextual details. More details are present which can help us with that identification of a constellation more clearly. In these more visionary or prophetic passages, sometimes it's not tying together into a story. So the constellational details are still there, but they're just kind of thrown at you one after another without necessarily tying them together. And so sometimes they're not trying to make them into a smooth flowing story when it's prophecy. You see that in Revelation sometimes as well, which means there may be fewer contextual details that can help us make a really confident connection or identification to a single conclusive constellation, although we can usually narrow it down to a small number of possibilities. So I just wanted to mention that. So in the passages in question from Daniel 11 and 12, Matthew 24, Mark 13, in each passage we begin with the discussion of the end of the temple, or the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple is foretold. In the Daniel passage, it talks about, well, at the end of the daily sacrifices, and those took place at the temple. Then both the Matthew 24 passage and the Mark 13 passage begin with Jesus being, the text tells us that Jesus is going out from the temple, and his disciples come to him to show him the buildings of the temple. In the Mark 13 passage, we're told that, quote, one of his disciples said to him, "Master, what manner of stones and what buildings?" And then in each case, Jesus answers and says, "Seest these great buildings?" Or in other words, do you see these great buildings? "There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And then he begins to go into this prophecy. So if the reader takes the mindset, or at least tries out the paradigm that these are talking about heavenly things, then we might be talking about a figure in the sky which might represent the great buildings of the temple, which is thrown down by that same daily motion of the Earth's rotation, which causes the rising and then the setting of stars, just like it causes the rising and the setting of the sun. It rises in the east, sets in the west. Same thing happens with the stars, although there are some stars that are far enough towards the celestial poles, the North Celestial Pole for observers in the northern hemisphere, that they won't actually go down to the horizon. But those that are along the path of the sun will set down behind the horizon. So that's what I believe this text may be talking about, right? And one stone not left upon another is going to be brought down to the level of the ground when it sinks down into the west. And I would argue, and I presented some evidence, more discussion of this in Star Myths of the World, Volume 3, which is Star Myths of the Bible, that in some cases where we're talking about the temple, in this case, we're talking about the Great Square of Pegasus. This great square, it's actually flanked by the two fishes of the zodiac constellation of Pisces, so that means it's pretty close to the ecliptic path, and it's going to sink down into the west for observers at almost all latitudes. So we can be fairly confident that this is the correct identification, because in the passages in Daniel 11 and 12, in which the abomination which makes desolate is mentioned, the prophet connects this to the end of the daily sacrifice. In Daniel 11:31 we read, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." The daily sacrifice is elsewhere described as the blood of rams and bulls, and the zodiac does have a ram and a bull. In fact, the zodiac constellations of Aries the ram and Taurus the bull are immediately adjacent to the zodiac constellation of Pisces, which is making a V that contains this great square in the sky. So the sinking down of the great square is going to be rapidly followed by the sinking down of Aries and the sinking down of Taurus. That is the end of the sacrifice in the temple being brought down in the sky. So based on our examination of this dual horizon action that we've discussed previously from other myths that we can see very clearly, I believe we may be talking about a dual horizon action here. And so these prophecies may involve a portion of the sky which is going to come into view when the great square is brought down to the level of the ground, and the ram and the bull also begin to disappear down out of the sky into the west. So let's have a look at the constellations and see which ones are rising when the square begins to sink down to the point that it's completely level with the ground, i.e. not one stone left upon another. When the square of Pegasus goes down, we actually have the serpent of Hydra and the cup, which is on its back, known as the constellation Crater the cup, rising up in the east. So could this have something to do with the abomination that causes desolation? It could be, especially because there are passages elsewhere which speak of a cup of abomination, a cup filled with abomination in Revelation 17, verse 4. There's also a passage which talks about a cup of desolation in Ezekiel 23, verse 33. Also, that cup of abominations in Revelation 17:4 is explicitly described as being in the hand of a woman, which again would undoubtedly be the constellation Virgo, directly adjacent to Hydra and to the cup of Crater. And notice that there in that Daniel 11:31 passage it says, "And arms shall stand on his part." That's the start of the verse. That may have to do with that rising outstretched arm of Virgo as the great square is sinking down into the east. But notice also that the Daniel 11 passage talks about the taking away of the daily sacrifice. So we also have to look at the setting into the west of Aries and Taurus, and that's going to take place after the square goes down. So that's going to bring more constellations are going to be coming up as Aries and Taurus are sinking. So we've got more sky to cover. So because of this, I would argue we can't be extremely precise in pointing to just one specific constellation, not necessarily saying, oh, it's Crater the Cup. As Aries is setting in the west, and then Taurus, other constellations are going to follow behind the rising of Crater and Hydra the serpent, including Hercules, Ophiuchus, and Scorpio, and all of those are arranged along this bright and most visible portion of the Milky Way band, which rises like a column up right beside them and actually right through Scorpio. And that may be important to our interpretation of these passages as well. Given the possibility that these prophecy-style passages have to do with the sinking of the great square in Aries and Taurus in the west, and then the rising of Hercules and Ophiuchus and Scorpio in the east, along with that Milky Way, Let's look at the scriptures to see if there's any clues or evidence that could support that suggestion. In both Matthew 24 and Mark 13, we see very specific descriptions accompanying the introduction of the Abomination of Desolation. Reading from the Mark 13 text, we find the following verses. "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him that is on the housetop not go down into the house, neither enter therein to take anything out of his house. And let him that is in the field not turn back again for to take up his garment. But woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days." So what could these verses be describing? What does it mean, let him that is on the housetop not go down into the house? It apparently has something to do with not hesitating, not going back. But what's this about being up on the roof? Doesn't that seem to be a little strange? Do many people spend a lot of time up on the housetop? Well, some say, well, it might be describing Mediterranean houses with flat roofs, or in the Levant, houses with flat roofs. It's kind of a Mediterranean climate. But how are you going to get away and flee without going down into the house? Does this mean that the lesson is we're supposed to be jumping down from the roof instead of going through the house? It doesn't actually seem to be to make too much sense unless you realize that this passage is pointing us towards a specific portion of the sky, specific constellations using coded language. If you look at the position of the constellation Hercules in relation to the constellation Ophiuchus, which is directly below Hercules in the night sky from perspective of an observer in the northern hemisphere, and you look at that shape of Ophiuchus, you can ask yourself if it might help shed any light on this passage about him that is on the housetop. I'm convinced that this passage is directing us to consider the constellation Hercules in conjunction with the constellation Ophiuchus. Those are exactly the constellations that we suspected based on that dual horizon action. We also have a pretty straightforward reference to the constellation Virgo the Virgin when it says, "Woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days." As I've explained in numerous previous videos, podcast interviews, books, blog posts, the constellation Virgo is frequently envisioned as holding a child, indicated by the star of her outstretched arm at Vindemiatrix. Indicated by this star, it's the name of the star is Vindemiatrix. But you can see that in this statue of the goddess Isis, the head of the divine child Horus is located at the end of her outstretched arm here, with Horus being held in her lap. This outline of Isis, and indeed even the shape of that throne symbol that's frequently depicted over the head of the goddess, those are both probably references to the shape, I believe, of the outline of Virgo, the stars in the sky. It has a kind of a throne shape. But Virgo in ancient myth is also sometimes envisioned as a mother about to give birth, because the constellation itself, so not necessarily sitting on a throne, but it proceeds across the sky on its back with its legs raised and apart. And so that's very suggestive of a woman in the act of giving birth. And frequently Virgo is envisioned as being about to give birth or giving birth, sometimes to the constellation Scorpio, which is located just below her there, or also to the constellation, occasionally to the constellation Ophiuchus. So this verse is referencing two different aspects of the constellation Virgo. One as a mother with child, as in pregnant with child, ready. One as a mother with child, as in pregnant, about to give birth, and another as a mother with her infant on her lap, preparing to breastfeed the baby or give suck, as the King James older translations will say, older way of saying it. So already we have seen some very clear indications that we're on the right track with our interpretation of the celestial references being made in these texts. Now, for help with this identification or this concept of the abomination of desolation, if we do a search throughout the scriptures for this term desolation, we'll find a large number of references that may help us to investigate further. Notice in multiple verses throughout the Hebrew scriptures that we see that desolation is associated with the destruction of a city, or the burning of a city, as well as with wilderness in the phrase without an inhabitant In other words, no one lives there, which is what the word desolate actually means. So, for example, in Jeremiah 34:22, we read, "Behold, I will command, saith the Lord, and cause them to return to this city, and they shall fight against it, and take it, and burn it with fire, and I will make the cities of Judah a desolation, without an inhabitant." So based on this is a pattern that we see over and over, this desolation when there's fire burning at the gates of a city. I believe that we can at least suspect that these desolation metaphors involve the smoky column of the Milky Way galaxy, which rises up right next to the constellation Ophiuchus, and it looks like fire or smoke. And Ophiuchus, in some myths, plays the role of the gates of a city. A lot of discussion of this in my 2016 book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, which is all about Greek myths. There's a lot of Greek myths where Ophiuchus is the gates of a city, or other gates, important gates. So the desolation may be the Milky Way when it's envisioned as a fire or smoke in front of the gates of the city. And it follows right after Crater the Cup and these other constellations that we've been talking about. But the Milky Way may play a role here. And as the Earth continues to rotate to the east of this bright portion of the Milky Way, which has these bright constellations, Scorpio, Sagittarius, and above Ophiuchus and Hercules, a very bright portion of the Milky Way. That's a very inhabited portion of the sky. But as the sky continues to rotate, then we get to a very empty sky without very many bright stars. H.A. Rey, in his essential guide to the night sky, published in 1952, called The Stars, A New Way to See Them, calls this region a dull region. He says, it's a dull region with few bright stars, on page 56, and he calls it the wet region because it contains constellations such as Aquarius and the Southern Fish and Cetus the Whale, and these are pretty dim constellations. Southern Fish has one bright star. That's like the only bright star in this whole portion of the sky. And in Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, which I just mentioned, I argue that this is the region of empty ocean that Hermes is described as having to fly over on his journey to Ogygia to visit Odysseus in the Odyssey. And the Odyssey says that Hermes doesn't like flying over. None of the gods like going over it because nobody lives there. There's nobody to sacrifice to the gods. It's uninhabited. It's like a wasteland, in this case a wasteland of ocean. But I believe that may be the desolation. This region devoid of inhabitants is what is being referred to as the desolation in the scriptures. And it follows, it's the portion of the sky that follows after that smoking column of the Milky Way and after Crater the Cup and these other constellations that we just examined. So as for this identity of the abomination itself, I don't believe the texts give us a lot of very clear celestial features to latch onto as we try and make an identification, but I'm going to suggest that it might be the zodiac constellation of Scorpio. We've already seen that the constellation Virgo is in many myths envisioned as giving birth. And in some of those myths from around the world, she gives birth to a figure associated with Scorpio. In the Maui myths, for example, from the cultures of the Pacific Ocean, Maui's mother throws him into the sea when he's born and even calls him an abortion. In some versions, we're told that she does this because the baby, when it's born, has 8 heads. Well, that clearly indicates the constellation Scorpio, which is often depicted as or envisioned as having multiple heads. Some cases it's 8, some cases it's 7, some cases it might be 9 heads. But when we're talking about Maui being born with 8 heads and then his mother throws him into the sea foam, that's Virgo giving birth to Scorpio, the constellation Scorpio, which is right beneath Virgo. In fact, in the Bible, in Revelation 12, the sign of a woman in the act of giving birth, travailing in birth. She's in labor, in travail. Then we're told a great red dragon with 7 heads appears, ready to devour the child as soon as it's born. That's another clear reference to Scorpio crouching beneath the upraised feet of Virgo as she's in the act, apparently, of laboring to give birth. Now, there's an interesting passage in Jeremiah 49 in which the text says that Hazor shall be a dwelling for dragons and a desolation forever. There shall no man abide there, nor any son of man dwell in it. Notice we have that same motif, no one dwelling in this desolation. And it's a desolation of dragons. That's interesting. You know, the Old English scholar named J.R.R. Tolkien may have been familiar with that verse, desolation of dragons. But we have desolation linked to dragons there in Jeremiah 49. And so, although it's not enough evidence to conclusively identify this phrase, abomination of desolation, with Scorpio, I would argue that it's likely that this phrase may be referring to Scorpio, which is sitting in the midst of the smoky column of the Milky Way, below the constellations of Ophiuchus and Hercules, and also below Virgo, all of which are clearly referenced in the Mark and Matthew passages. So it's clearly referencing Virgo, Hercules, Ophiuchus, and it says the abomination of desolation. I believe that may be Scorpio. And it is worth noting that I've made an entire video which argues that the constellation Ophiuchus also plays the role of the Ark of the Covenant in other parts of the ancient scriptures of the Bible. Here is a link to that video. Now, the scriptures tell us that the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the most holy place. And note that in Matthew 24, Jesus says the abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place, which may be describing Scorpio rising in the midst of the Milky Way, immediately underneath the constellation Ophiuchus, which in other parts of Scripture plays the Ark of the Covenant and thus indicates the holy place. So there's other celestial references in these passages, but I believe at this point we've established beyond a reasonable doubt that these texts are describing celestial figures, and that there's a dual horizon action going on here with the setting of the great square in Aries and Taurus, and then the appearance of Virgo, Crater, Hercules, Ophiuchus, Scorpio, and that smoking column of the Milky Way, and then that empty or desolate version of the portion of the sky which follows behind them and contains Aquarius. So what does that mean for these passages, for our understanding of these passages? I think the first thing we can say is that they're not describing literal historical events, whether in the past or in the future. These are celestial metaphor. This isn't a future prophecy that's going to take place in historical, earthly, terrestrial history. Unfortunately, these passages have been taken literally by those who believe that they're giving a timeline of events for a literal great tribulation and end time, and they've taken them as like a blueprint and saying, oh, well, this verse says that the gospel has to be published among all the nations, or the Matthew version says preached among all the world, in order to set the conditions for these specific events described in Matthew and Mark that are believed to represent literal terrestrial events that are going to take place on earth, rather than understanding that this is celestial metaphor. What we can also see is that these metaphors have to do with heavenly cycles, especially that's this dual horizon action is very clearly talking about these heavenly cycles, not just of the Earth's daily rotation on its axis, which does cause the rising and setting, but also the progress of the Earth around the sun on our orbit creates an annual cycle of the seasons. And it also causes the backdrop of stars to change in very much the same way that it changes during the night as it's rotating. But we get different constellations coming up in different times of the year, different seasons of the year. And you can see a lot of references to seasons and times of year in these passages, which we'll talk about. The ancient wisdom uses this annual cycle, this lengthening of days and shortening of days, the interplay of light and darkness, to convey truths about our own journey through this incarnate life. That's what I'm convinced that these stories are doing. They're using them as a symbolic language to describe not just what's going on in the heavens and not just the seasons of the year, but these are linked to spiritual concepts, descending from the realm of spirit into this realm of matter and taking on a human body. Just as in the Adam and Eve story, we're told that Adam and Eve are given coats of skins after they're banished from the garden. After they're thrown down from the realm of spirit, they're given coats of skins. They're incarnating in a human body. The motion of the stars sinking down out of the heavens is a perfect way of typifying or allegorizing this motion of the soul coming down out of that realm of pure spirit up there and plunging down into this lower realm down here, the lower elements of earth and water. When the star hits the horizon, it sinks down into earth or water. And that's like us plunging down into a body that's made out of these lower elements of earth and water, or, as the Bible says, made of clay. Also in ancient Greek myth, Prometheus makes humanity out of clay, men and women out of clay. The interplay of light and dark through the seasons of the year are used by the world's ancient myths in a similar manner. When the plunge down into the lower half of the year, which takes place at the fall equinox, symbolically typifies the descent out of the upper realm and into this lower realm, the material realm, where we take on a body. These ancient myths also typify a second birth, a spiritual birth, which is associated with the turning point of the year at the winter solstice. So the first birth is when we come down from the upper half of the year into the lower half, or when the stars sink down into the horizon. And the second birth is at that lowest point where the turning back upwards happens. It symbolizes our awakening to the fact that we and everyone else around us has a spiritual nature as well as a physical nature. The constellation Virgo is often associated with that first birth into the material body at the fall equinox. And the constellations Sagittarius and Scorpio, which flank that brightest part of the Milky Way and stand just before that lowest turning point of the year at the winter solstice, are often used to signify or to point towards the second birth, the spiritual birth. If you read through the Daniel passage and the Matthew and Mark passages that we've been examining, describing the leveling of the temple and the rise of the Abomination of Desolation and a period of tribulation, you'll see that the passages are replete with references to the changing of the seasons. For example, both the Mark and Matthew passages include the command to pray that your flight be not in the winter. That's Matthew 24:20 and Mark 13:18. They also both include a reference to the shortening of the days in Matthew 24:22 and Mark 13:20, and also to the darkening of the sun and the moon, Matthew 24, verse 29, and Mark 13 and 24. And I believe those are describing heavenly cycles, the conditions that take place every year when the days are shortened as we approach the winter solstice. And the darkening of the moon, of course, takes place once a month. The lunar cycle is monthly. I'm convinced that all of these heavenly cycles, referenced in metaphorical and prophetic language in the ancient texts that we've been looking at, have to do with the cycle of the soul's progress in the cycle of incarnation, or incarnations. As Alvin Boyd Kuhn says in the quotation cited at the beginning of this discussion, the one actor in every portrayal, in every scene, is the human soul. The Bible is the drama of our history here and now, and it's not apprehended in its full force and applicability until every reader discerns himself or herself to be the central figure in it. Instead of relating to the incidents of a remote epoch in temporal history, it deals with the reality of the living present in the life of every soul on earth. I know that if you've been accustomed to taking the Bible literally, you might be initially shocked or dismayed to see evidence that these ancient scriptures, in common with all the other ancient myths and sacred stories the world over, are speaking a language of celestial metaphor rather than a language of literal history. However, I do not believe that this understanding takes away any of the beautiful truths of their message. It only takes away the distortions which come from externalizing and literalizing the message. For example, I'm convinced that these passages are actually intended to convey a very beautiful message that should unite humanity and lead to greater compassion for one another. When they're taken literally, they tend to divide people because the message is externalized. In this case, they're seen as describing a literal tribulation in which those who believe in the literalistic interpretation of the gospel stories will be separated from those who don't. That interpretation has led to these attempts to preach the gospel in all the world and to convert people from their own sacred traditions, when it can be demonstrated that all the world's ancient sacred traditions are built on this same worldwide system. However, I believe the intended message, or at least on one level of the intended message, can be seen very clearly at the end of the Matthew passage, which goes on longer than the parallel text in Mark. At the end of his discourse, Jesus declares, "For I was hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me." Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee and hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Matthew 24, 25 through 40. Now this is a very beautiful and moving passage, as is the converse that follows immediately after, when it says, when Jesus says that if we ignore the suffering of others, we are also ignoring him. And I'm convinced that the sentiment contained in these powerful verses is directly established by the spiritual metaphor that preceded, that's connected in the ancient wisdom with these heavenly cycles that we saw with this dual horizon action, and talking about the interplay of the seasons and the light and darkness and the lengthening and the shortening of the days. This interplay of light and dark throughout the year figure for us the interplay of spirit and matter, and are intended to awaken in us the understanding that we are not merely matter. We're not just a physical body, but that we have a spiritual nature. Not just a physical nature, a spiritual nature, a divine spark, an immortal component that is not doomed to die the way our physical body is. And this same message holds true for every single man or woman or child that we ever meet. So the scriptures have Jesus tell us that if we neglect or abuse or despise or fail to have compassion for even the least man, woman, or child, we are abusing or despising or failing to have compassion for the divine Christ, because each and every person we ever meet has a divine nature, a divine component, as well as a physical nature. And if we only see them for their physical nature, we're making a tremendous error. I believe that the esoteric understanding of these passages reinforces that profound message. Far from ruining the message, the understanding that these passages are not literal actually enhances the message. That's why in a different place, Alvin Boyd Kuhn says that, quote, the sacred scriptures of the world are 1,000 times more precious as myths than as alleged history. There's nothing in the message that is enhanced by having to take them as literal history, in my opinion. The truths are just as beautiful, just as profound, just as inspired, just as beneficial, and just as sacred. I don't know why some think that these texts can only be respected or valued if they're believed as literal history. In fact, the literal interpretation tends to externalize and thus to distort the message to the point that it no longer becomes the story of each and every human soul, applicable to each and every man and woman, but becomes the story of external characters, external events, and then being seen as being applicable only to those of a certain group, such as those who consent to believing them as literal terrestrial history. And when it comes to prophecies about the so-called end times, a literal interpretation can lead to all kinds of very misleading and, in fact, morbid and dangerous actions and opinions, which can and do have very real consequences. I hope that this discussion of the prophecies in Daniel 11 and 12, Mark 13, and Matthew 24 and 25 has been helpful to you in some way. Their message is actually a beautiful message. The divine nature dwells in each and every man and woman and child, and in us and in everyone we meet. That message is conveyed and envisioned in the heavenly cycles of the sun, the moon, the visible planets, the stars, and the constellations. Their motions describe the interplay of spirit and matter, but they tell us that we have a spiritual component. We came down into this material body and we sink down into matter, but there's this turning point where we realize our divine nature, our immortal, our spiritual nature, the divine spark, and we begin to reconnect with that, and we recognize that in other people. And so this message is intended as a blessing to lift us up and to encourage us to lift up those around us, including through the ministering to their physical needs, such as hunger and thirst, which is talked about in Matthew 25, as well as to their emotional needs and their spiritual needs. So thank you to everyone who sends me messages and questions. This one I feel was very important and one that I wanted to address in some depth. And I think that concept of the dual horizon action in some myths is a very important concept to understand. It's a special subset of myths, and I believe it's used here to great effect in these passages that we just looked at. I believe that the ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories given to humanity are a precious inheritance which we can and should be consulting and listening to on a daily basis. And I'm convinced that we have a much better likelihood of hearing their answers for us when we listen to them in the language that they are actually speaking.